Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us with Shami Chakrabarti, human rights lawyer and campaigner and Labour peer. She was Shadow Attorney General for England and Wales from 2016 until spring 2020 and Director of Liberty, the National Council for Civil Liberties from 2003 until 2016. Before that, she was a lawyer in the Home Office from 1996 until 2001. She's campaigned, spoken and written widely on a number of equality and human rights issues and published 2 books on Liberty 2014 and on Women 2017 on Penguin. So I'm really pleased to be speaking to her today and for you to be joining us. Thank you, Shami.
Thank you, Hannah. The last thing anyone needs from me right now is a reminder of how the world and all our lives have changed over the last 4 months. But I'd like to begin with my solidarity for anyone worried about loved ones or who's lost them in recent times. Even in these days of social distancing, self-isolation and all these bitter pills, words and practices, you're not alone. And my respect to everyone working night and day to care and provide for the rest of us. The very fact that this celebration of the Tolpuddle Martyrs is happening in the manner of science fiction is a reminder that we are virtually but not actually together. Some of us have sufficient health, food, shelter and internet access to be able to engage in this discussion, and that places us under greater duty constantly to think about those who don't. Our ongoing response to this global pandemic here and all over the world will either exacerbate every inequality, inconsistency and injustice in how we share the planet or bring us closest together. The world before Covid-19 is past, the status quo ante not an option. I know this brings terror to some, hope to others and a strange cocktail of both to many. These are hugely dangerous and difficult times, but I believe that a combination of innovation, imagination, empathy, experience and learning could help us find our way through. And any brighter future must have human rights values at its centre. Rarely has there been such a stark choice between discarding values or being guided by them, even in times of emergency. Just as the word security conjures either incarceration or comfort, lockdown can signify protection or prison, depending on our circumstances, attitude, and the practical policy approach of those in power. So what do I mean by human rights values? Well, firstly, I don't mean unfettered freedom. In reality, there's never been such a thing. Unrestrained liberty for the wolf looks a little bit less attractive to the lamb. Even a so-called free market requires a great deal of rules of the game to prevent people robbing and cheating each other, to bind them to the deals they struck with each other, and to prevent cartels, monopolies that eat the choice and competition on which the market is supposed to depend. And that's before you even get into debates about employment, consumer and environmental protections. The functioning of the free market has always required significant regulation to keep it that way. The same is true of democracy. What's the value of elections if people don't have the vote or are afraid of using it? What if a winner-take-all government were to use its massive majority and powerful friends to censor and silence critics, defame opponents, and even to postpone further elections? Just like the market, democracy is capable of eating itself and descending into something really quite different. So some of our rights and freedoms, notably to vote in free elections, associate with each other and speak, sometimes privately and sometimes in public, are, if you like, the fair competition rules for democracy itself. And at the most basic level, Each human being needs a great deal of freedom, protection, and nurturing to survive, let alone thrive. And our rights tradition recognises this and our essence as amazing individual creatures, but always social creatures nonetheless. We need protection from interference, intrusion, oppression, and cruelty, but also from infection, isolation, destitution, and starvation. And we must have roses, or at least the opportunity to find them in fuller lives of the heart, mind, body, and soul. You wouldn't dream of inviting a guest into your home to share in the food and shelter, but not the music or discussion. Attempts to dismiss either civil and political freedoms or social, economic, and cultural rights are just as foolish. Nor is this a vain attempt at eliminating risk from our lives. The wartime generation responsible for this settlement knew all too well how impossible that would be. Rather, they were concerned with valuing life and not allowing the powerful to take reckless risks with the lives of others. Post-World War II human rights are a legal, ethical framework of rights, freedoms, and protections, all springing from the idea that all human lives matter and that we're born equal in our dignity and worth. Thirdly, it's so important to emphasise that this isn't just about law. Human rights values form part of our ethical and political thinking as well. So those who say the problem with demanding rights is that it avoids responsibility couldn't be more wrong. Your right can't be delivered without my obligation to respect it. So it's of course correct that states and governments have the ultimate responsibility for protecting the human rights of their people. But these rights can never be a practical reality without a great deal of legal and moral responsibility on all people as well. Take the rare but absolute right not to be subject to inhuman and degrading treatment or torture. That's not just about military and police personnel being prohibited from behaving in that way, nor is it merely about states providing and enforcing adequate criminal laws against violent and sexual offences. It's also about how we treat each other when no one's looking, and the vulnerable can't complain. That's in the home, hospital, care home, police station, and nursery. There'll never be enough legislators or police officers on the planet to deliver human rights by law alone. And even if there were, who would protect us from them? So those like Jonathan Sumption, who attack human rights for blurring the line between law and politics, are also missing the point. There has never been a bright line between law, politics, economics, culture, or even religion. Human rights values are both shaped by all of the above and vital animators of them. There are, of course, perfectly proper debates to be had about how best to promote, inspire, deliver, or enforce certain outcomes at certain times. Sometimes the lever you need is encouragement, sometimes investment, sometimes hard-edged law, including a range of sanctions. Often, it's a combination. So, we have a long and hard-won system of international human rights. It contains checks and balances and rights and freedoms for our civil and political, social, economic, and cultural life at home, work, in our democracy and wider world. It doesn't solve all our complex problems, but it gives us a compass to help in their navigation and some tests for our proposed solutions. So far, so good. Why then still so controversial? Well, in my experience, everyone loves certain rights and freedoms, particularly their own. It's other people's protections that are sometimes a little bit harder to swallow. My speech is free, but yours is a bit more expensive. I want the right to travel, shop, and entertain myself unhindered, even during a global pandemic, even poisoning the planet in the process. I'll take my own risks, thank you very much, as I do when I drink or smoke or eat unhealthy food in spite of the advice to the contrary. That is surely my right as a free-born Englishman. Well, yes, to a degree. But we've long said that you can't drive the car or fly the plane whilst intoxicated because of the risk that you inflict upon other people. We've more recently prevented you from smoking in certain places for a similar reason. And now, just because you feel the reckless invincibility of a lifetime of privilege, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't balance your right to roam against the rights of others around you, and especially the health workers, professionally and ethically bound to pick up the pieces when your hitherto considerable luck, or that of others around you at the roulette table, runs out. Or as Esther Weber wrote in the Times in response to Desmond Swain's extraordinary anti-mask outburst in the House of Commons last week, by all means, defend the rights of the freeborn Englishman, but not the rights of the airborne pathogen. The reason why human rights have often proved so controversial is that they belong to everyone equally, whether we like them or not, and they must be applied with an even hand. This is why they rub up against the rich, the powerful, arrogant, and entitled, who'd otherwise have it all their own way. And this was never more true than now. Some would sacrifice the vulnerable to preserve the very inequalities that left us exposed. I'm not of their number. Inevitably then, in this crisis, as in the financial crash and war on terror before it, human rights values are tested at every turn by a whole range of very real personal, societal, and global dilemmas, and by the inconvenient obstacles that attempting to value everyone, however vulnerable, puts in the way of business as usual for the financially and politically powerful and otherwise strong. To put it bluntly, any sacrifice the sick and the elderly to save the economy argument is as much anathema to human rights thinking as sacrificing the poor on the altar of the banks or introducing racial profiling in the fight against terrorism. But let's look in a little more detail at some of the many issues raised by the virus and how we might approach them. I want to begin with language rather than law or even ethics. Wartime metaphors abound in some times of crisis rather than others. They inspire comfort and caution in almost equal measure. I think it's worth unpacking why that is. Everyone knows that wars are supposed to be patriotic, unifying, and just. Let's park imperial and illegal wars of aggression for a moment, as those who prosecute them rarely admit to as much. A war is both a time of great peril and privation, and one where a nation is for the most part likely to come together, even temporarily sacrificing both luxuries and some essential liberties against a common enemy. So the danger that the war footing presents to democracy is obvious. Citizens and interlocutors like journalists, civil society, opposition politicians are likely to be less critical of government for fear of distracting from the war effort or even seeming disloyal. However, the vital safeguard is that however indefinite in the moment, the firm expectation is that a war must be temporary and there'll be an end at some point. And we, the people, will know when it's over. Not because some powerful person in a suit or uniform tells us so, but because of the evidence verifiable by our own senses. A treaty signed or bombs stopped falling, casualties cease, and the troops come home. Now, if I'm right in this analysis, you can see both the attractions for leaders in, for example, the war on terror metaphor, and the dangers for citizens. The language was supposed to inspire uncritical support for all sorts of illegal and unethical policy and practice, breaching rights against torture, arbitrary detention and discrimination, and so on. Yet crucially, and completely unlike any conventional war, as terrorism or politically motivated violence has always been part of the human experience, the war wouldn't just be indefinite, it would be without end. Then, of course, came the global financial crisis of 2007 and 8, bringing enormous losses and sacrifices to many, and not, it would seem, to those most heavily responsible for the reckless lending, complex securitization, lack of probity and regulation that caused the emergency. The collapse of the banking system was necessarily prevented by eye-watering bailouts from national governments, but equivalent support was not in the main provided to those lower down the financial chain. So there followed evictions, foreclosures, long-term unemployment and austerity. The world became even more unequal, and some people, including those working in and most dependent on public services, paid a disproportionate price. Interestingly, while some of the political rhetoric of the period may have been reminiscent of the pulling together and belt-tightening language associated with war, the explicit war metaphor wasn't reached for this time. To be fair, that may be purely because injuries and casualties of austerity are slower in the making and perhaps more invisible than those caused by the actual violence of both war and terrorism. However, it might also be that a full war footing after the crash might have begged obvious questions as to the identity and nature of the enemy. Questions that the world's super wealthy and powerful might struggle comfortably to answer. Now, the sheer speed and savagery of the pandemic awakens the wartime spirit and express analogy once more. Now, I, for one, a lot less wary than I was after 9/11 and those calls for an unending war against an abstract noun. Tragically, the number of civilians lost to the virus in the UK over the last few months is already more than half our civilian casualties for the whole of World War II. However, if we're to put up with wartime sacrifices, we must surely expect the conduct of the war to be informed by our dearest values, and crucially, for sacrifices to be shared rather more evenly than they were after the crash. It's often said that the ultimate human right is the right to life. Yet this isn't quite true or deliverable given that we're mortal. Further, many ethical traditions and all legal systems allow for some exceptions, even to the prohibition on taking human life, for example, in war, or when there's no choice to protect someone from killing others. However, the duty to protect life is such a serious one upon all states that it comes with corresponding rights to investigations into untimely death that will, I have no doubt, require full independent inquiries into the handling of the pandemic at local, national and international levels. The danger, of course, is in a so-called blame game, with politicians, officials and expert advisors engaged in self-conscious self-protection exercises at the expense of their best work, even in the midst of the crisis. But if there were sufficient transparency and accountability for difficult decision-making now, in real time, it would lead to better decisions, better public understanding of them, and less need for dramatic revelation or opprobrium later on. This is harder to achieve in less democratic nations, but there's no excuse for a lack of openness in our own. Unlike in real war, where secrecy is essential in the face of a national enemy, keen to know your armory and strategy, ambiguity and obfuscation aids the virus, and clarity transparency and cooperation, even globally, as how to combat it. In particular, and there's just no running away from this, the suspension of community testing, tracing and isolation strategy in the UK in mid-March, and sending health and care workers to the front line with inadequate protective equipment was the equivalent of sending unarmed, unprotected soldiers into a war zone. It was a significant violation of the human rights of the very heroes we applauded every Thursday night, and a breach of the state's duty to protect them. This is only compounded by various attempts at preventing people speaking to the media about their working conditions. We can only begin to imagine the post-traumatic stress disorder of survivors. Analogies here might be drawn less with World War II than with the trenches of the First Great War. Then there are a whole host of rights and freedoms that have been either seriously diluted or totally suspended by the coronavirus legislation, health regulations, and lockdown. There are almost too many to detail, but who would have thought last autumn, when the Supreme Court ruled against an illegal suspension of Parliament, remember? When everyone was a barroom constitutional lawyer instead of an armchair epidemiologist, that we would now have laws banning people gathering in even quite small groups, let alone in mass protests or at religious, sporting and cultural events. Who'd have imagined, even during last December's general election, that spring local elections would be postponed, funerals and burial rites all but suspended, and that there would be power to section the mentally ill with only a single doctor, to deny disabled people the dignity protected by proper care plans. These chilling measures, in many respects, go beyond anything ever seen, even in wartime. And the test of the laws themselves and of their application and enforcement is in whether they were or continue to be necessary, proportionate, clearly set out in law, and non-discriminatory. 6 monthly reviews and the ultimate 2-year expiration are important, but so is the ability to challenge any abuses of power in the courts under the much maligned and completely essential Human Rights Act. Of course, civil legal aid has all been obliterated over the last 10 years, drastically restricting access to justice in a way that's even more unacceptable in present circumstances. The stories of patchy and inconsistent enforcement are troubling, to say the least, and no doubt connected, in most cases at least, to the cock-ups that come from rushed law and chaotic guidance, rather than deliberate and malign abuse of power. But a hands-up and open approach on the part of both legislators and enforcers would once more be a refreshing change from the bunker mentality that organisations develop in ordinary times, let alone those of crisis. But it isn't just enforcement that sometimes seemed inconsistent. The law was asymmetric to begin with. A necessary lockdown on the liberties of millions of individuals came without any new provisions to take action against unscrupulous employers demanding that workers turn up and labour in unsafe conditions, or take various grants and loans only to lay off large numbers in any event. And even as some people started panic buying food and other essentials, and others profiteering from their panic by inflating the prices of hand sanitizer and face masks, no new legislative power was taken to deal with this. Indeed, where was the prompt voluntary coordination, let alone compulsory requisitioning of private hotels and hospitals, labs, factories, food, supply and delivery chains to ensure that tests, PPE and other essentials reached those with greatest need rather than wealth? Social, economic and cultural rights Of course, just legal aid hasn't just been ravaged by austerity. Health and public health, mental health, policing, local government, and other social infrastructure, more vital than ever in times like these, appear frayed, fragmented, and under-resilient due to a combination of underfunding and outsourcing. The debates about the importance of a national health service run for public good rather than private profit are surely over now. The idea that anyone should be able to pay for treatment for the deadly virus in preference to someone with less resources but greater need verges on the obscene. And when a vaccine comes, Big Pharma and friends cannot be allowed to hike prices and restrict production whilst millions suffer and perish. If liberties must be temporarily diluted, why not patents? We are dependent more than ever on a whole range of frontline workers in health and social care, cleaning, refuse collection, transport and essential retail who are living from hand to mouth on low, even poverty pay, and with informal and insecure employment. They can't be forgotten now or after this pandemic. Applause and even medals will not secure their futures. And even more than with the crisis in the financial system, this virus in the respiratory one has demonstrated just how interconnected we are. The call for an end to homelessness has never been more pressing, not just for this period, but indefinitely. Rent postponement must be replaced with rent forgiveness, reasonable rent control, and more affordable and social housing. Shelter, like healthcare, is a human right, as basic as speech and fair trials, not a commodity to be hoarded by some and denied to others. The virus has not been a great leveller, but it has been completely revelatory in demonstrating our interdependence and how once more some people are required to pay so much more heavily for the decisions of others in both physical and economic risk and cost. The debate about the reopening of primary schools has been a case in point. The work at home if you can and go to work if you must message begs the questions of why some can and others must, who decides and with what criteria. The just following the science mantra has rightly been criticised by scientists as both obfuscating the uncertainties of the new disease and the fact that advisors only advise and politicians make decisions on the basis of a whole raft of competing factors and interests, not always transparent. Of course, primary schools are a vital source of childcare for working parents, as well as places of stimulation, socialisation, education, nutrition and safety for our poorest children in particular. Hence they remained open for the children of key workers throughout the lockdown, even at moments of least readiness and protection and faster spread of the infection. Yet the particular bile reserved for our teachers' representatives for merely asking questions about the speed and safety of the proposed date of June the 1st for the national return of some age groups was a particular low point. Those commentators with holier-than-thou vitriolic attacks in the name of the poorest children haven't always been renowned for championing greater educational or economic equality in the past. Teachers, like everyone else, are entitled to ask reasonable questions about school, child and community safety. Having suffered so much already as a result of the virus and lockdown, everyone needs a comprehensive system of tracking, tracing and isolating the pandemic before protections are lessened and greater degrees of normalcy resumed. No group of people should be expendable as if in the treacherous mines, mills, potteries and trenches of the past. The economy exists to serve human society, not the other way round. Which brings me to my conclusion, and the most important principle against which to test all law, policy, practice and results. We know that the enemy, in this case coronavirus, discriminates. Its worst effects are felt by the old and otherwise physically vulnerable or sick. But there are also alarming figures suggesting racial differences, and the poorest have suffered most from both the contagion and the measures designed to combat it. If these facts really appall us, are we prepared for radical action to redress the balance in the future? Were so many of those in mostly private care homes, including some who made sacrifices for our freedoms during World War II, left to suffer or perish, inadvertently or by design? That will no doubt be a critical question for the inquiries to come. But there are many other questions for all of us, even now. Having experienced varying degrees of restriction and isolation ourselves, have we acquired some greater compassion for actually incarcerated people, whether innocent asylum seekers or convicted prisoners? Do we stand as well as take the symbolic knee with the Black Lives Matter movement? Or do we strain to socially distance ourselves just enough to look tougher on the toppling of slave traders' statues than on systemic, structural and entrenched inequality? Having spent a little time reflecting on what really matters, will we invest in the best care, shelter, education, communication, culture, sport, entertainment, nutrition, yes, for our own families, but for everyone else's families too? Do previously rival and even warring nations now have more to gain from cooperation or xenophobic blame games? And has the vicious virus sufficiently reminded us of the precious and fragile nature of our existence to motivate more urgent efforts to save our planet from climate catastrophe? In exposing our weakness so brutally, might the pandemic, like earlier terrible trials, have inspired a greater cherishing of our humanity? Thank you for listening, and stay safe.
Thank you so much, Shami. That's really powerful words, and you've given us a lot to think about and touched on so many important topics. So thank you so much for this. Welcome to people who've joined us in the middle of that or who are still joining. We're taking your questions, so please do put them to us. This is being recorded, but it is a Zoom only session. So thank you so much for that wonderful, powerful speech, Shami. Moving on to the questions section, we've already had a few people come in with questions. I'll start with Ron from Bristol, who has asked, if the government sent frontline NHS and social care workers into the battle against COVID-19 unprotected, and therefore in violation of their human rights, can a case be made that the government should be held accountable at the International Criminal Court?
I think that is, in reality, I mean, morally, I'm completely with you. But I think in practical terms, because of the challenges in bringing anyone to that court, even in relation to illegal wars and, you know, more conventional jurisdiction for that court, I think that's a hard ask. However, I think there are definitely issues for Human Rights Act liability closer to home. In principle, you'll know that, for example, there were successful cases brought by families of those who were sent to Iraq and Afghanistan with inadequate equipment. You know, their rights were upheld in the courts here in the UK and in the Court of Human Rights. You know, in principle, states have a duty to protect people, particularly people that they put in harm's way, and that would apply as much, in my view, to health and social care workers as it did to military personnel in armed conflict. So I think there may well turn out to have been breaches of rights under Article 3 of the Human Rights Convention. That's the right not to be subject to inhuman and degrading treatment. To Article 8 of the Convention, that is interpreted broadly as a right to, you know, physical protection and autonomy. In principle, I think that there are there are legal issues there that could be dealt with. You don't need to go all the way to an international court. As long as we have the Human Rights Act, they could be dealt with. They could be dealt with at home.
Thank you for that. A question from me personally. Some things that have really touched on me as a PCS member are the cuts, the ongoing cuts. And you touched on how COVID is interacting with that and us being unprepared for something like this, possibly. Focusing in the justice cuts briefing, which is something that PCS has been fighting against. Justice has been one of the hardest hit areas, with the budget cut by over 40% in the last 10 years. Since 2010, over half of the courts in England and Wales have closed, and a further 77 courts are earmarked for closure over the next 6 years. How do you think those cuts are going to affect us as individuals and the general public in terms of accessing their rights?
Well, I so agree. I mean, obviously, this is very close to my heart, because I've been a lawyer for most of my life now. For my adult life, and I've always been a public interest lawyer, and I have seen, even in my adult life, how those cuts have just made it so much harder for most people, not just the poorest people, by the way, but most people in this country, realistically, have pretty poor access to justice, considering this is one of the wealthiest nations on earth. And to go back to that sort of post-World War II settlement that gave us universal education, and gave us the NHS, and gave us the safety net, the welfare safety net, it also gave us legal aid. Legal aid was a really, really important part of that post-war settlement, and it's been, decimated isn't even the word, because that suggests sort of 1 in 10. Obliterated is actually a better word for it, and so that's been a problem anyway over the last 10 years, and it's an even bigger problem now, because if you link your question to the previous question, what about all these poor health and cleaning workers and social care workers and others who were put in harm's way, either deliberately or negligently? Where's their redress? Well, I can say we've got a Human Rights Act. A number of Tories have wanted to axe it, but they haven't managed to do that yet. We've got a wonderful Human Rights Act, but if you don't have legal aid, how do you actually get to court to vindicate your rights if you are a worker who's been put in harm's way without protection and negligently? If you are the family member of you're the son or daughter of a nurse or a doctor or a cleaner or a transport worker who has died in this, and how do you vindicate your rights without legal aid? And that's a massive problem. And the government needs to think about this, because some of these cuts were actually ideological. It wasn't just, austerity is always ideological, by the way, because economics is not a natural science, it's politics, right? Every decision that every chancellor, every government makes is a political decision. As I say, this is not natural science, this is political science we're talking about, okay? So that's political decisions and choices that are being made. So austerity is always a choice, and some people pay more than others. But in the context of the pandemic, it's magnified, because it's not a leveler, COVID, it's a magnifying glass. And the government needs to think about this in the context of its settlement with the people. I don't believe that we can go back to the way things were in January of this year. And I think people will want more support for the NHS, more support for social care. They will, things that were laughed at when we campaigned last December, like universal broadband. Yeah. Oh, what a ridiculous idea that the government should ensure that there's universal broadband. What a lot of nonsense from Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. Well, it doesn't look so nonsensical now, does it? I suspect to a lot of people who wouldn't be able to who wouldn't be able to come on this call without adequate broadband. So we need a new settlement, and I think that applies to legal aid too. Because, for example, we've now taken this very, very draconian legislation, which I supported, which I never thought in my lifetime I would be supporting in Parliament legislation that bans mass gatherings, for example. And I did that because of the existential threat to people's lives of the pandemic by social mixing, okay? So I supported that, but I knew that that legislation opens up risks of abuse, okay? And what do you say to people in that? You have to say, if there are abuses, you will be able to challenge them, including in the courts, because that is what the rule of law looks like. You don't just hand massive powers to the government without checks and balances. And one of the checks and balances, which even the government, cited in its defence when it had to do this legislation, was the Human Rights Act, which means nothing without legal aid. And you've now got this situation where you've got people like Desmond Swayne and Jonathan Sumption and other right-wing libertarians complaining about their liberties and infringements and face masks and all these things. Jonathan Sumption has said that the police have behaved like prefects and this is a police state because he ought to be able to, drive his Range Rover to a beauty spot to walk his Labrador and let the elderly shield themselves, and it's not so serious, this virus after all. Well, fine. But if there's no legal aid, most people will not be able to challenge genuine abuses of power. And so I think that a lot of people who've been anti-judicial review, anti-Human Rights Act, anti-legal aid are going to think again, even in the Conservative Party and even, I hope, in the Conservative government.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. I think a lot of those issues, the closures, the cuts, as the Southwest is quite rural, we are heavily affected by this. And there's areas, especially Cornwall, where the cuts have especially been hard for us. More questions. I've got one here. The current government is very against the Human Rights Act and has tried before to get rid of this one way or another. Is this still a very real threat?
I think it has to be a real threat because we have a right-wing Conservative government with an 80-seat majority in the House of Commons. So that's point one. It's obviously a threat. Look at the mathematics. Look at the culture of this government. A lot of these people are all over the public record over a number of years, speaking against the Human Rights Act, speaking against the judges, speaking against judicial review, in almost an ideological sense. Okay, that they've got a visceral problem with it. But as I pointed out, there seems to be this weird hypocrisy stroke contradiction between that, but also sort of banging on about the rights of freeborn Englishmen, etc., etc. So I think it is a very real threat. And we have to say to them, you can't on the one hand rely on the Human Rights Act when you're trying to get people to vote for your coronavirus legislation, and when you're telling people that there is a rule of law and there are protections for people's rights. You can't say that. You can't rely on it 1 minute and then try and sweep it away the next minute. And I think that maybe that hypocrisy will be more in plain view if they come after it. But I think my experience when I was director of Liberty, I have to be honest, sometimes even Labour politicians could be quite authoritarian and could even speak against the Human Rights Act. But the trade union movement, in my experience, always got it, because trade unionists all through their history have understood the importance of your liberties, even to organise, even to strike, even to march, even to demonstrate. And sometimes even Labour parliamentarians don't sort of have that, that sort of visceral understanding in the same way. And I had a lot of support across the trade union movement when I was a young director of Liberty, when sometimes I was having to say difficult things even to Labour governments. So I would hope that when these threats come again, to the Human Rights Act, that the trade union movement will be a really, really important part of the defence.
Thank you. It's good to hear the work and the beliefs of the trade union movement empower what you're doing, and that you know you're supported by that. So we've got some more questions. It's scary that the running down on lockdown has been led by the needs of businesses. How do we resist when so many people are scared for their future employment?
Well, you know, as I said in the talk, you know, the economy is supposed to be for people. The economy is not this abstract thing. Hello, economy, how are you today? Let me shake your hand. Let's have a chat. You know, and there's this way of making it abstract that is designed to make us think that we have to go and work in unsafe conditions. There isn't another way around it. Of course, there's a way around it, which is, and this is supported by lots of world bankers and the World Health Organization and all sorts of economists too understand that you need to protect people, and that's how you protect your economy, which is about, the economy is only a sort of language and arrangement for people to engage with each other and share and produce resources together. That's all the economy is. It isn't something over there. And so what we have to do is to demand of government that people are protected. That means that they have income when it's not safe to go to work, that the workplace is made safe, and that means with enforcement. I mean, isn't it ridiculous that we've seen, for example, we've seen police officers breaking up picnics on the beach or whatever it is. Fair enough, that was their duty, that was in the law. But where have we seen the pictures of enforcement by the Health and Safety Executive and or the police on unsafe construction sites or in unsafe warehouses, etc., etc.? There has to be symmetry to protective measures. That's what I would say. So we must demand that when it's unsafe to work, people are given whatever income protection they need, and that businesses will be supported as they have been. But the trade-off is that a business that wants grants or other government support needs to protect its workers, and that means protecting them when they have to work at home or be furloughed, but also protecting them in the workplace by enforcing safe working practices, social distancing, and so on. It's really not complicated. And ultimately, with the greatest of respect to the Amazons and the other, the Googles and the Amazons and the other big names on which the world seems to be even more dependent in a lockdown or semi-lockdown situation, they need to pay some tax. They will have been, all sorts of people, I suspect, who normally don't like shopping that way, have been shopping that way. And it's perfectly reasonable that these giants of the internet should be contributing back into the communities and societies worldwide that they are profiting from.
Yeah.
And it's not rocket science. It's really very logical, and we just need governments to be a little bit braver about this and protect people and people and the economy that is there to serve people.
Thank you so much. And we've got another question bouncing off that topic, really. All of us who've been shielding as extremely vulnerable will somehow not be extremely vulnerable overnight on August the 1st. Could you discuss the implications of this?
Well, I think you can probably all guess what I'm going to say. There's been a little bit too much of the language of, and it started very early on actually, the language of save the economy, and frankly sacrifice some vulnerable people. And I'm not making this up, because you can read this in newspaper columns, you can read this in interventions, by really quite lauded people like, I picked on Lord Sumption because he's, he's a case in point. He was a celebrated Supreme Court justice, but I don't hear him speaking up for legal aid. I hear him saying, my rights and freedoms to run around and not have a lockdown, and we've sacrificed the economy, and we should have just, blah, blah, blah. So I don't think that we've always been transparent. I don't think the government has been transparent through this process, so that we could all have a properly informed public conversation about the science. I know that the science is not perfect because it's a new virus, but I don't believe that the government has been transparent about the advice it had at SAGE early on. I think quite possibly the lockdown came late, and it's conceivable then that the lockdown has ended at times prematurely, or if not prematurely, without adequate protections in place. I just think there's, in certain quarters, particularly in the Conservative government, but not exclusively, there is a desire stroke temptation to say that things are safe because the motivation is, let's get back to business as usual. We can save the economy, but what kind of economy? We want it to be an economy for people and not sacrifice the vulnerable. As I said before, it was wrong to sacrifice the poor on the altar of the banks, and it was wrong to racially discriminate in the fight against terrorism, and it's equally wrong to sacrifice or make the vulnerable even more vulnerable so that we can get back to a business as usual. There is no business as usual. Some people think they can magically go back to January 2020. I don't believe that to be the case. And so some of us want to move forward to a fairer settlement. Other people would prefer to move backwards to, if not to 2020, to 1920 or 1820. And that is the struggle. And I think it's a very, very stark, a very, very stark choice at this moment.
Thank you. So we've only got about 6-7 minutes left. This may be the last question, but it's a good one. We've touched on the fact that COVID has obviously taken over all of our minds, and it's affected everyone and everything so thoroughly, but we do still have the climate crisis and Brexit as really big issues that we need to stay focused on as well. So this question is, do you think human rights law will change in the UK after Brexit?
I think we've got to, I think we've got to be super vigilant. We've got to be super, super vigilant because, when we were talking about the Human Rights Act being under threat before, one of my concerns, it's not just you've got a far-right Conservative government with an 80-seat majority with form for anti-human rights rhetoric. It's all political correctness gone mad, blah, blah, blah. And remember, they used to say that about health and safety as well. It used to be Human Rights Act and health and safety legislation that used to get bashed, not just by Boris Johnson, but by Theresa May and David Cameron, and it goes back, right? There's a long tradition of this. So we've got all of that cultural stuff, plus their current majority. But the other thing we've got is that anti-European xenophobia is a sort of appetite that never gets sated. So say we have a very hard Brexit, a hard right Brexit, or, goodness me, even a no deal Brexit, and really, really tough consequences that would come from that. The danger with this kind of divide and conquer distraction politics is that the next thing from Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and co will be, and now we've got to go further and we've got to scrap the Human Rights Act and come out of the European Convention on Human Rights as well, which are not directly linked to Brexit. You could have Brexit and keep the Human Rights Act and keep in the Council of Europe and the Strasbourg Court, but will they want to do that, or will they want to throw more red meat to their fans in the culture war, in that sort of xenophobic, anti-European, nationalistic politics that's very Trumpian, and now sadly Johnsonian too. That's what we've got to be vigilant about, and we've got to, we've got to stick together on this, and we've got to fight back and make the connections between human rights and not just fighting the pandemic, but dealing with every big problem that the world has to face. Not just Britain, not just little England or little Britain, not just Europe even, but the world. It's shrinking and interconnected, and we need to address that, and with human rights at the centre of our response.
Thank you, Shami. It's been absolutely wonderful having you with us. I'm so pleased that you've spoken to us. We're near the end now, so if you can make some closing remarks and let us know what you want us to really take from this session and what each of us can do as individuals in your mind. Thank you so much, Shami.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Hannah, for your chairing of this. Thank you to everyone who came to my virtual Tolpuddle talk. It's a strange way to do it, but I'm so glad that we're doing it. And equally, there are ways in which we might be engaging with people in other parts of the world who wouldn't necessarily have even come to a real life Tolpuddle. As I said, this crisis is not a leveler, as some people have said, but it is. It does expose everything that was already there, and it could bring us together. We must use this moment as a catalyst for positive change. There's no going backwards. We're only going forwards, and we have to shape what that future looks like. And I think what we need to do individually and collectively, particularly through our trade union movement that we are celebrating after all here in virtual Tolpuddle, we need to be more ambitious, more radical, more visionary, not less so. And what I was really trying to say in my talk is, let's not. Yes, it is a wartime crisis in a sense. It is, given the death toll, given the challenge we face. But we shouldn't use that. We shouldn't be afraid of criticising the governmental response, and we shouldn't be afraid. We should be like that 1945 generation and say, we're putting up with these privations, we're pulling together, but after this, what we want is a new, more progressive, more radical, more egalitarian settlement. And I think we can all push for that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Shami. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed that. And remember, there's a lot more going on this weekend. We will be cut off any moment now, but do look at the Facebook group, look at the YouTube, have a look on the website. If you are able, please do donate. And thank you so much again. Thank you, Shami.
Thank you, Anna.